What's one moment in your life that changed everything in your family?
I am going to say this plainly because dressing it up would only make me feel like I am lying to myself. I covered my parents' mortgage for years because they said they were drowning, because they said I was the responsible one, because they said it was what a good daughter does, and I kept doing it even when it squeezed my budget and kept me from things I had put off for too long. And then my birthday came around, and they forgot it again. Not a call, not a text, not a card, not even a lazy post on social media. And I sat at my small kitchen table staring at a cupcake I bought for myself, feeling stupid for thinking this year might be different, and I realized I was financing people who could not be bothered to remember the day I was born. My mom, Linda, loves to spin stories about struggle, and my dad, Robert, backs her up with that calm tone he uses when he wants to sound reasonable, and for the longest time I believed them because I wanted to be a decent person. And because I learned young that if I kept things steady, the house stayed peaceful. But there is a special kind of quiet that sits in your chest when your own parents treat you like a utility bill, and I felt it that night so strongly I could barely swallow, and not because of the cupcake. I told myself not to make it a thing. I told myself to let it go like I had let it go so many times. But then my brother Ethan called 2 days later to brag about a new networking event he had gone to. And he asked me if I was free for his birthday in a few weeks because mom and dad were planning something, and he said it like he was inviting a fan to a premiere, and I heard myself say yes even though part of me went numb. And after the call I stared at the automatic transfer scheduled on my banking app and felt a heat in my face that would not go away. People like to say families are complicated, and that is neat language for a mess that never stops, because when I was little Ethan was the golden kid who needed attention, and I was the one who could handle a no, and it looked harmless when we were children. But it grew teeth as we got older, because my no turned into doing without and his attention turned into expectation, and every time I asked for something I was told to be practical, while every time he asked for something the answer was, "We will figure it out." And somehow their mortgage became my responsibility after dad lost a job and mom said lenders were being cruel, and she promised it would be temporary, and I agreed because I thought temporary meant a season, not a lifestyle. Here is the part that will sound harsh, but I think you will understand it. The night they forgot my birthday again, I opened a group chat with friends, wrote a message I did not send, and deleted it because I did not want pity. And then I poured a glass of cheap wine and read my own budget line by line. Rent, groceries, car insurance, savings, and there it was, the transfer to a house that was not mine, and it hit me that I was being the adult and the child in this family at the same time, paying the bills while begging for crumbs of basic attention, and I hated that feeling so much that I could not sleep. The next morning my mom called to tell me about a deal she found on a flight bundle for Ethan's party because it was going to be big, and she wanted to make it special, and she said it in that bright voice that always sounds like she is selling something. And I waited for her to remember my day, and she did not, and when I cleared my throat and said nothing she rushed on with details about menus and themes, and I listened to her talk about Ethan like he was a celebrity and I was customer support. And when she paused to ask if I could help with a little extra this month because things were tight, I said I would look into it, and after we hung up I stared at my reflection in the dark phone screen and said out loud that I was done. I need you to understand that deciding to be done does not feel clean or brave in the moment. It feels like a small mutiny inside your chest, like you are breaking some rule you did not sign, and I kept asking myself whether I was overreacting, whether I was being petty, whether the decent thing would be to stay quiet and keep the payments going, and then I remembered every time I had swallowed a slight to keep the peace, and how peace never came, and I realized I had to stop waiting for them to be people they had shown me they were not. So I made a rule for myself that morning. I would say yes to my own life first, which meant looking at that automatic transfer not as an obligation, but as a choice, and once I framed it as a choice it became very simple, because if I could choose it, I could unchoose it, and I did not hit the button that day. I let it sit like a test to see whether I would fall back into old habits, and I decided I would wait through the week, attend the planning calls, and watch how they behaved, not because I needed more proof, but because sometimes you need to feel the full weight of a pattern before you cut the rope. A few days later, I stopped by their house to drop off some mail that still comes to me for reasons that never made sense, and while Mom was in the other room, a small velvet pouch slid out of a kitchen drawer, the kind that does not hold candy or coins. And when she hurried back and nudged it closed with her elbow without meeting my eyes, I did not ask a single question. I just smiled and said I would see them at Ethan's party, and as I walked back to my car, the decision that had been forming finally locked in place, because there is a point where you stop hoping they will pick you, and you start picking yourself, and I had just reached it, while a very expensive secret sat in their drawer waiting to be unwrapped. Ethan's birthday landed on a Saturday that should have felt ordinary. Yet the way my mother floated around the room with that bright voice that means she has already decided who deserves attention and who should stand back made it clear that ordinary was never an option in our family when it came to him. And as people clapped and laughed, and my father gave his little speech about how proud he was of his son's promise and drive, I stood there with a careful smile that felt like holding a heavy box for too long, and I tried not to think about the cupcake on my kitchen table from the week before or the velvet pouch I had seen sliding back into their drawer like a secret returning to its nest. When the moment came, my mother reached for that pouch with a flourish she could never resist, and even though she pretended to fumble with the drawstring like it was no big deal, her eyes told the truth, because she lives for the reveal. And when Ethan pulled out the watch and everyone inhaled like they had witnessed a miracle, I did the math I was not supposed to do, the math that connected my monthly transfer to a steel and gold circle on his wrist, the math that said their mortgage had been paid right on time while the gratitude meter for their daughter stayed at 0, which is not a number I use lightly, but it fits the way silence lands when it is not just forgetfulness, but a habit that has been practiced for years. Ethan slipped the watch on and made a show of pretending it was too heavy, and he laughed while saying he could get used to the weight of success, and my father nodded with the kind of approval I used to chase like a moving target, and for a second I caught my mother's face. And there was a flicker there, a quick calculation about whether I was going to ruin the mood by noticing what I had already noticed, and I gave her a smile that said I would not make a scene, because the loudest thing I could do at that table was keep my voice calm and collect my thoughts, and I already knew that anything I said aloud would be twisted into me being dramatic. So I said nothing that anyone could use against me, and saved every word for the conversation I was about to have with myself. People think breaking points are explosive, but in my experience, they arrive like a quiet line you cross without fanfare. And as I watched my brother hold his wrist up for pictures while my parents hovered with the pride of people who believe they have invested their resources wisely, I opened the banking app on my phone under the table because I do not owe them a performance. And I scrolled to the automatic transfer I had set up the year my father lost his job, and my mother told me the bank was being cruel, and I read the little description I had written to remind myself it was temporary, and I remembered the first time I told myself I would stop, and the second time, and the third time. And I understood that this was not going to end through patience. It would end because I ended it. I went home after the party without staying for cake or to hear Ethan's toast about resilience, and I set my phone on the counter and sat on the floor because I wanted to feel the decision in my body before I executed it. And I opened the app again and stared at the toggle that would cancel the monthly draft, and I thought about how many times I had been told to be the bigger person, and how being bigger had somehow come to mean being used, and I thought about the language my mother loves. The one about family pulling together, which always seems to translate into me pulling the hardest, and I whispered that I was allowed to pull for myself now, and then I pressed the button that turned off the transfer. And I copied the confirmation number into a note with today's date spelled out in full words like a contract written by a person who has finally learned that boundaries are only as real as the enforcement. I did not call anyone to announce it. I did not post a cryptic quote online. I simply redirected that same amount into a savings account with my name alone on it and set an alert that would ping me every month as a reminder that choosing myself is not a one-time event, but a practice I will have to keep choosing. And it felt less like revenge and more like a reset, yet I will not pretend it did not carry a bite, because the truth is I wanted them to feel the consequences of the story they had been writing with my money and their denial, and the most effective way to teach people who ignore quiet kindness is to introduce quiet consequences. When my mother called 2 weeks later with a voice already on the edge and said the bank had reached out and something must be wrong because the payment did not go through and could I check my end, I took a breath that held more history than I care to admit and said I would look into it, then let the silence stretch long enough for her to hear that the script had changed, and as she stumbled over explanations and asked whether I was okay, I told her that I was finally more than okay and that I had indeed made a change, and before she could spin another story I added that I would explain everything when we met in person, which is when she whispered my name like a warning and I said we could sit down tomorrow. Because I wanted them to see my face when I told them the words they had never expected to hear from their obedient daughter, the words that would make my father put down his coffee and my brother stop admiring his wrist. The next afternoon, I walked into their kitchen with the kind of steadiness that comes from repeating a sentence to yourself until it settles into your bones, and I took the chair that always used to be mine when I was the child expected to be reasonable. And I watched my mother set down 3 mugs like props for a conversation she planned to direct while my father folded his hands and asked, in that practiced calm voice that always means he expects cooperation, whether there had been some banking error because the lender had called twice and the portal showed an unpaid balance, and before my mother could soften it with her usual script about tough times and family teamwork, I told them clearly that there was no error, that I had stopped the automatic transfer, that I would not be restarting it, and that the years of payments I had made were not a down payment on endless obligation, but a season that had ended. Which is when my mother gasped with theatrical hurt while my father's eyes sharpened in a way I have only seen when he thinks a negotiation is slipping away from him. I did not raise my voice, because the point was not to perform outrage, but to keep the ground under my feet. So I slid a thin folder from my bag and placed it on the table with the printouts of the payments I had made since the first month my father lost the job he still blames on everyone but himself. And I watched both of them look at the dates and amounts and the little note I had written to myself on each yearly total as if they were reading a language they did not expect me to speak, and before they could pivot to gratitude mixed with pressure, I said that I understood what I had chosen all that time, that I did not regret being generous, and that I was done being invisible while being generous, which is a sentence that lands heavy when the people across from you are used to your compliance. My mother said that families do not keep score and that I was embarrassing them with accounting, and I said that I had spent years pretending a scoreboard did not exist while paying the bill on time, and that me writing down what I paid was not cruelty. It was clarity, and when she tried to pull Ethan into it by saying he was under stress and deserved support, and that the watch had been a little joy in a hard year, I told her that little joy could be returned or sold to cover what my generosity had covered for too long, and I said it without malice because I did not need to sting. I needed them to hear math, and Ethan, who had been leaning in the doorway like a spectator at his own parade, finally crossed his arms and told me I was blowing things out of proportion and that successful families invest in their highest potential, which is when I smiled in a way that let him know I heard every word and filed it under the exact story I was no longer willing to live inside. My father began the guilt litany about everything they had done for me when I was a child, and I nodded because none of this erases real parenting. And then I said that parenting is not a subscription I am obligated to renew with interest until the end of time, and that I had already contacted the lender to remove myself as third-party contact so that all notices would go directly to the borrowers whose names are on the note, and I added that any attempt to open new credit or accounts in my name would run into a freeze I had already placed, not because I suspected them, but because boundaries are not real until they are backed by action, and if that sounded cold then maybe cold is what happens when warmth is mined without consent for too long. My mother's tears arrived on cue, and she asked how I could do this when they were trying to keep the house, and I said I was not making them lose a house, I was allowing them to run the house they chose, and that if they wanted a plan I could suggest one that did not include me as the bank, which meant my father calling the lender to ask for a hardship review like any adult would do. My mother canceling non-essential expenses she swore were small, but that always add up, and Ethan, who loves to talk about potential, converting potential into a first mortgage payment by selling a luxury he had worn for exactly one photo opportunity, and the look he gave me would have been funny if the stakes were not so high. because it is hard to be the favored child when the bill for favoritism lands with your name on it. We went around the circle of arguments that families use when they want the old pattern back, and each time I answered with a sentence I had rehearsed in my head while staring at that cupcake on my kitchen table, which was that I was no longer the buffer that absorbs their consequences, and that I would not discuss their mortgage by phone anymore, only by email where words cannot be twisted or forgotten. And when my father muttered that I was being dramatic, I pushed the folder toward him with a pen and said he could write down the apology he felt ready to offer for letting me carry a burden they hid from the family while telling themselves it was temporary, and I meant it not as humiliation, but as an invitation to grow. Which is exactly how my mother chose to hear it until she glanced at Ethan and changed her mind. I stood up when my voice started to shake because old reflexes still pull at me, and I said that I was going to leave before anyone said something they could not take back. And I added that I had already updated the lender portal so that all alerts and mail would land in their box instead of mine, which meant the timeline just got real for the people who had treated timelines like stories they could rewrite with another favor. And I walked out while my mother said my name like a siren, and I got in my car and set my phone face down, and I let the world be quiet long enough to hear my own heart go steady. While back in that kitchen the folder lay open like a mirror they finally had to look into. And by the end of the week the first late notice appeared in their mailbox with their names printed in large letters, and when my mother called to say the bank had scheduled a call for the following Monday, and what was I going to do, I answered that I had already done it, and that if they wanted a lifeline they could start by taking off the watch and listing it, because the price of my help was the truth, and if they were not ready to pay that price then they were finally going to learn how to live with the bill. The call started before sunrise and rolled past midnight like a tide that had no concern for anyone's schedule but their own. With my mother leading with trembling questions that were really accusations, and my father following with measured phrases that tried to sound like leadership while asking me to correct my mistake and restart the transfer because this was bigger than a disagreement. And somewhere in the background my brother kept adding colorful commentary about how families invest in winners and how I should stop letting my feelings ruin things for everyone, and I kept answering in the same even tone I had promised myself I would use no matter how hard they pushed, telling them that the decision was final, that any conversation about their mortgage had to happen by email, and that showing up unannounced would not get them what years of pretending not to notice me had failed to secure, which is respect built on honesty rather than manipulation dressed as love. 2 days later they tested the boundary in the loudest way possible when they walked into my workplace lobby with the sort of determined faces that used to make me fold when I was a teenager. And I watched the receptionist glance at me with concern while my mother started a story about emergencies and family duty, and my father asked for a conference room as if he supervised my calendar, and I felt the old reflex to fix everything tug hard. But I remembered what I told myself in their kitchen. And I chose to protect my space, so I asked building security to keep them in the public area. I let my manager know I was handling a private matter that should never have arrived at the office. And then I walked down to the lobby with a posture that said I was not a child and not a checkbook, and I invited them to sit with me on a bench where everyone could see that I was calm, and they were not, which is a small mercy because chaos hates witnesses. My mother began with tears and a plea that I undo the damage because the lender had set a deadline and the word foreclosure had been spoken by a stranger who did not understand our family, and she reached for my hand as if skin could fix what choices had broken. And my father leaned forward with that voice he uses when he is negotiating a car price, telling me he would reimburse me eventually if I could just cover a few more months, because things were about to turn around, and I let them speak. Until the heat in my cheeks faded, and then I said that I was not going to let them use my employer's lobby as a stage, that they were not to return to my workplace again, and that if they did I would file a formal complaint with building management and a written notice with human resources that would trigger a security protocol none of us wanted to test, which made my father pull back as if I had threatened jail time when what I had done was finally protect my job from their chaos. Ethan sauntered in a few beats late, angled his wrist so the watch caught the light he obviously thought it deserved, and told me to stop acting like a victim and start acting like an adult because real adults make hard choices for the tribe. And I thanked him for the performance and told him I had prepared something for him since he likes concrete steps. Then I slid my phone across the bench with a draft listing I had built for his luxury piece, complete with a clean description, clear resale comps, and the precise language buyers look for when they are ready to move quickly, and I said that if he posted it by the end of the week and forwarded me the confirmation, I would share a written budget template and make introductions to a lender counselor I had already researched who could restructure the payment schedule in a way that did not involve me, and if he chose not to post it, then he and our parents would have made a different choice, which was to explain to extended family why a house payment had been sacrificed to fund a photographed accessory. My mother protested that I was humiliating them and that I was turning private matters into spectacle, and I said that I had kept their secrets for years and that keeping secrets is not the same as keeping a family together. And my father muttered that I was airing dirty laundry, and I answered that it was not laundry when it was a ledger, and that airing it was what happens when people refuse to open a window, and then I added the only condition that mattered to me, which was that if they contacted my employer again or used threats or guilt as currency, I would send one concise email to the relatives who believed my parents were financing everyone's success, containing only the dates and amounts I had already shown them and the single sentence they had refused to say, which was that their daughter had kept their roof steady while they pretended she did not exist on the days that should have mattered. They went quiet in that particular way that says they are calculating rather than listening, and I stood because I could feel the conversation try to tilt back into the ditch of old roles. And I told them the meeting was over and that I expected a simple yes or no on the watch listing by close of business on Friday written in an email, and I reminded them that every call would go to voicemail and that every voicemail would be transcribed and archived. Not because I was petty, but because I had been trained by them to document what matters, and my mother whispered that I was breaking the family, and I said what was breaking us was the refusal to accept that grown people are responsible for their choices. And then I walked back through security while the receptionist lifted a sympathetic eyebrow and my phone buzzed with another incoming call I chose not to answer. That evening I completed the part they did not see, which felt less like revenge and more like the clean edge of a boundary sharpened into action. Because I sent building management a formal notice that my parents and my brother were not to be admitted without my written consent, I filed a brief memo with Human Resources summarizing the incident with names, times, and a firm request that any future appearance trigger a call to security, and I set a timed email in my drafts addressed to the family group that would send automatically if my parents showed up again at my workplace or condo. And as I watched the little timer icon sit beside the message like a loaded parachute, I felt a steadiness I had not felt since I first agreed to cover a payment that was never mine, while somewhere across town a wristwatch waited for a decision that would tell me everything I needed to know about whether they wanted a house or a symbol. And the last thought I had before I slept was that if they made the wrong choice, the truth would fly on its own. By the time Friday arrived, I had stopped wondering whether they would surprise me with decency because the silence in my inbox told me everything, and when the sun went down without a single subject line from them, I knew they had chosen pride over survival, which is the family pattern written in bigger letters than any mortgage notice, and I also knew that waiting for them to collapse on their own terms would only invite another round of guilt and manipulation, so I decided that the story I had been keeping for years was finally going to see the light, not with drama or slander, but with plain details that even the best spin could not disguise, and that truth, once revealed, would do what I alone had never been able to do, which is shift the balance of power permanently. On Saturday morning, I scheduled an email to go out to our extended family group, a collection of aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends who had been told for years that my parents were the stable foundation, the responsible adults who funded Ethan's promise and deserved admiration for their sacrifices, and I attached a clean spreadsheet with dates and totals, all drawn directly from my bank records, showing the monthly transfers that had kept the house afloat. And in the body of the email I wrote a single paragraph in a steady tone that explained how I had been asked to step in during a time of temporary need, how temporary had stretched into years, how the arrangement had been hidden to preserve an image. and how I had finally chosen to stop because no child should be carrying their parents' mortgage while also being told they do not measure up, and I ended it with a line that simply said that truth does not need commentary, which is the most cutting sentence I have ever written, because it offers no hook for argument. I did not stay glued to my phone waiting for reactions. I went about my day, bought groceries, cleaned my apartment, and let the first wave of messages roll in without opening them. Because I wanted the silence before the storm to feel intentional rather than anxious, and by evening my cousin called to say she had no idea I had been carrying that weight, that people were shocked, that my parents were already scrambling to explain it as a misunderstanding, and I told her calmly that it was not a misunderstanding but a set of choices, and that the documents spoke louder than anyone's words, and she said that people were angry at how much Ethan had been coddled while I was ignored, and I admitted that anger was not my goal, clarity was. But if anger came with it, then maybe it was earned. By Sunday afternoon, my mother left a voicemail that cracked between rage and desperation, accusing me of humiliating her, of tearing the family apart, of exposing private matters that did not concern anyone else. And then her voice shifted to pleading for me to undo the damage, promising that things would change if I gave them one more chance, and I listened to every word with the kind of calm that comes from finally having evidence stronger than guilt. And when she said my father was sick with worry and Ethan was humiliated, I thought about how many birthdays I had spent with my own kind of sickness, sitting in silence while everyone else celebrated the chosen child, and I did not feel guilty, I felt steady. Because humiliation was not what I had given them, accountability was. My father tried a different approach with an email that landed late Sunday night, written in his clipped style that always reads like a contract, saying that while he understood my frustration I had overstepped, that my actions had created irreparable harm, and that I should consider the long-term consequences of alienating my family, and I read it twice, and then replied with one sentence that said the long-term consequence of continuing to fund lies was self-erasure, and that I had finally chosen not to erase myself anymore, and then I shut my laptop and let the silence hold that truth because silence, when chosen, is not absence, it is authority. Ethan did not call me directly, but through mutual friends he sent the message that I had ruined his reputation, that potential investors were whispering, that I had cost him opportunities. And I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of blaming me for what he had always done, but instead I wrote back through a mutual channel that the only person who had cost him credibility was the one who wore it on his wrist, and that if he wanted to repair anything he should learn to hold his own bills before reaching for applause, and I left it there because I was done being his backdrop. Within a month the foreclosure notice was formal, the bank letters shifted from warning to action, and my parents had to explain to family members why they could not refinance without help, and each time they tried to paint me as the betrayer, someone else would forward them the spreadsheet I had sent, and that was the beauty of releasing truth. It no longer needed me to defend it. It defended itself with numbers they could not twist, and eventually the calls slowed, the accusations dulled, and the silence that had once meant neglect now meant peace, and I sat in my apartment looking at the savings account that was finally growing and thought about how different a boundary feels once it stops being an idea and starts being a practice. I will not tell you that everything feels healed, because family wounds rarely heal cleanly, but I will tell you that I no longer feel like a forgotten daughter financing her own invisibility. I feel like a woman who drew a line and enforced it. And the fallout was exactly what I expected and exactly what I needed, because the house that once symbolized their control is no longer my burden, and the watch that once symbolized their favoritism is now their reminder of the price they paid for ignoring me, and the question that lingers is whether I would forgive them if they admitted the truth, and I do not have an answer yet, but what matters more is that I do not need their answer anymore, because for the first time in years, I am living a story that does not require their approval to exist.